that's how she is. Yeah.
So Mark, are you gonna sit on that side?
We like it. I've got two little, my sister's
We'll take up the whole
and I'm trying to root on it, but I'm just not having much luck. Although my basil. What? I just need to pot it out. I've got some little tiny pots here.
Hey, Joe.
I need to put it on space.
Yeah.
But my one is.
Well, the weather,
I
the
can't
weather's
remember.
probably
The
not
other one's
helping.
called the mother-in-law's pot.
Oh, yeah.
Or something.
There used to be a
Yeah,
wall.
Oh,
You can see up
okay.
there at the top where it's.
Oh, yeah.
There used to be a wall there.
So if you have any cuttings that you want to bring,
They'll put it up for us.
Just what I need. I know, right? I'm not gonna have to go to the library for months.
You want to see this one? I'll sit back there. Cedric in the house?
It's not too far from us. They did probably about 15 minutes from us. They're doing good. Michelle, please.
I want to welcome everyone to our Bible study. It's about time to get started. In a moment, I'm going to ask Brother Mark Hill to lead our minds in a word of prayer. I'd like to first ask everybody to open your Bibles to the book of Esther chapter 8 as we finish chapter 8 this morning and we go into chapter 9. Esther chapter 8. If you're using the Pew Bible, Esther is on page 382. 382. We want to welcome all of our friends and brethren who join us online from home. We appreciate you being here with us. We also invite you to open your Bibles to the book of Esther chapter 8. As we continue the study of this great woman hero of the Old Testament, and also as we look at the hand of God and His providence in the book of the Bible that you do not read or find the name of God. At this time, let's go to God in word of prayer.
Father Almighty, we humbly come before you this morning. We give you praise and thanks for all your blessings. We thank you for this time that we can come together to open that word, to study from it. We ask that you be with us as we study, that we can draw from your wisdom, that we can use this wisdom to apply to our lives. We ask you, Lord, to be with Luther as he recalls the things he has studied, and to be with us as listeners. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen. And one thing we've done throughout this book, and I'll ask you to do it, we might take time to talk about it in class, but I want you to look to where you see the providence of God, perhaps in the book, or you see something that God would have used in His providential care for His people. When we get up to Esther chapter 8, just kind of bring a couple charts up on the screen. These have been lessons so far of courage and faith of this young lady that became queen. Started with very humble beginnings. She lost both her parents, took care of by Mordecai, enters a beauty contest. She wins, she becomes queen. Time goes on. The bad guy Haman arises up. You know, Haman really wasn't around for too long of a time. And but then we started seeing that these are also lessons in the providence of God. And so we want to keep that on the forefront. Our key passages have been Esther 4, verse 13 and 14, the latter part of verse 14, where Mordecai told Esther, "Yet who knows whether you come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" I like reading verse 14 because we're now on the other side of that. We're seeing that Mordecai's trust in the God of heaven, his faith in the God of heaven, has proven true. Now, the story's not over yet. The Jews have not been saved yet. But we see, the wheels with the hand of God and things on earth turning in that direction. In chapter 8, we studied so far that Esther finishes her work to save the Jews. She's given the house of Haman. Mordecai is promoted. We talked about, just to look at the logistics, if Haman has been demoted and then hanged, at some point the king had to remove the signet ring before or after the hanging. He gives it to Mordecai, and this is all on the same day when the night before the king could not sleep, and a helper of the king brings a history book of the chronicles of Ahasuerus' kingdom and reads about Mordecai. A lot of things happen within this 24-hour period of time. Esther requests the salvation of her people, chapter 8, verses 3 through 10. These are passages we've already studied. Mordecai and Esther are permitted by the king to write the new law, and it is the 3rd month of Sivan. I'm probably pronouncing that correctly, Sivan or Sivan. And how many months until the first decree goes into effect and the Jews, the people have permission to kill the Jews and take everything they have? So if the Jews were going to be killed on the 12th month, we're only at the 3rd month. How many more months we have? 9. So very quickly, if Mordecai, 100 days earlier, if Haman, 90 or 100 days earlier, got the king to issue that decree, look how quickly the book of Esther has moved. Now God has set up that, Esther took 3 days for fasting and asking the Jews to fast for her. In 2 days and 48 hours, she throws a feast. At the end of the 48 hours, Haman is hanged. Haman's bad deeds took place in about 3 months. Now God gives 9 months for some things to take place for the saving of his people. And we came down to verse 9, and we see where all the king's scribes are called together. And again, it's the 3rd month on the 23rd day. And Mordecai gives the command that the letters are to be written through all the provinces. And it's the latter part where it says to the satraps, to the governors, to the princes of the provinces, from India to Ethiopia. We'd seen earlier how vast his kingdom was. 127 provinces. We have 50 states. Think about if you had to handwrite letters to 127 states and have people physically take those letters. You can't email them. You can't get on the phone and call somebody to say, hey, we have a new decree in place. Then you have to write it in its own script. You have to write it in own people's languages. It has to be, translated different languages, and it has to be carried out. And so it's a gigantic task that has to take place, and you have 9 months before the killing of the Jews. So the decree is published. Go ahead.
Before you go any farther, I was just sitting here thinking, when they have to write it in all these different languages, they also probably have to have somebody proofread it, and I'll tell you why. I deal with people that are from different cultures. I work with Ukrainians, Russians, and everything else. And some things get lost in translation.
Yes.
And so if you stop and think about it, they also would have to have somebody proofread it, which mean which I see the hand of God here as well, because of the fact is, in order to make sure everything is on the up and up and perfect, God has to be involved with that.
Yes. I think exactly what you're saying is right, and I think you see that at the beginning. It have to be implied, and I'm implying it. You don't read it like you just said it, and you're correct. At the beginning of verse 9, so the king's scribes were called. You're going to have scribes that know the Persian language, know the Indian language, know the Ethiopian language, and you're going to make sure it's all written correctly. I don't write anything, send it out, unless I have somebody proofread it, because there's going to be something goofy in there somewhere. I'm still learning English. They had to get this written to all these provinces. It's a vast task Haman's dead, and the plot has been uncovered to kill the Jews. The king was tricked. But now you have to fix the problem. And chapter 8 is the fixing of the problem. And from chapter 8 to chapter 9, you have 9 months. We go to see, well, what happens after the issuing of this second decree. So let's read verse 11. By these letters, the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and to protect their lives. Now let's just bring everybody up to date who's at home and who's in the building. 100 days earlier, Haman tricked the king into signing the decree that on the 13th day of the 12th month, that everybody in his vast 127th province, great territory, country, could kill every Jew and take everything they had. I'll tell you what, talking about some free money, right? There's some quick money. You just got to wait till the 12th month to get it. And now a decree is going to be published that, since that decree cannot be canceled because that's the custom of the Persians and the Medes, a new decree is going to be published that the Jews can protect themselves. You see that in verse 11. And it says, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions. On one day, in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, a copy of the document was to be issued and as a decree in every province and published to all the people. Now, this is the second decree. It's happened within 100 days, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. I mean, you can just see this play out like you're watching a movie. Look at verse 14. Here's the action part. Then the couriers who rode the royal horses went out, hastened and pressed on by the king's command. And the decree was issued in Shushan, the citadel. Now Mordecai went out from the presence of the king. Can you imagine that scene and what he's wearing? We're told what he's wearing. In royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. That'd be Jews and not Jews. You know, they thought this first decree was rather strange, and it troubled the whole city, 100 days ago. And now they see Mordecai. We could say a lot more about that, but let's move on. Verse 16, the Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor. Notice the 4 descriptions given there on now how the Jews felt after the 100 days of distress because of the first decree, because of evil Haman. And in every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the horsemen got there with the decree, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews because fear of the Jews fell on them. So, the second decree has been published in every city. And it's interesting that Mordecai is honored in Shushan. So we have studied, and I don't have my chart with me on the timeline. This is about the 12th year of the king. I think we began chapter 1 with the 3rd year of the kings. 9 years have gone from chapter 1 to chapter 8. What do you know about Mordecai's reputation in Shushan, among the Persians? What was his reputation? Well, what did they see in him? What would they see him do or not do? One, did he have a position?
They see honor in him.
Okay.
I mean, in faith.
Yes.
Because, I mean, he's doing everything according to the law. It's apparent that he's doing everything according to not only the Persian law, but he's doing everything according to God's law, and he won't violate God's law. So therefore they see a man who is honorable.
Yes. Remember back in chapter 3 in verse 2, it says that Mordecai will not bow down to Haman and give him homage. Now Haman's promoted the vice president of this vast kingdom, only the one man under the king. And Mordecai, as a Jew, would not bow down and pay homage, but everybody else did. So Mordecai had a reputation before this happened of being probably an honorable man. He lived by his faith.
Taken in Esther.
Pardon?
I'm pretty sure they knew his reputation of taking in Esther.
He took in Esther, raised Esther. Pure and undefiled religion is to visit orphans and widows in their times of needs. Visit there means take care of. Doesn't mean to go by and see them. That was under, that God desired that under the old law and the new law. And we see that even the day these events take place, the first day that they take place with the feast, we see that Mordecai, again, would not bow down and pay homage to Haman, and that infuriated Haman that he went home and he complained about it to his family. And so what you see now in verse 15 is a man who's had a good reputation. He saved the king's life years earlier. And it says in the Bible, now Mordecai went out from the presence of the king. Now that, you're walking out of the highest building in the land. And from the king's presence. And we've already talked about the sensitivity of being in the king's presence. He is wearing royal apparel of blue and white. He has a crown of gold on his head. He had garments of fine linen. The king has dressed this man up, given him the signet ring. There's a copy or a picture of an Egyptian signet ring on our screen. He has the signet ring. He's now been promoted to the position of Haman. He is the man second under the king who saved the king's life earlier. And how did the non-Jews react in verse 15?
They were glad, they rejoiced.
Right. Mordecai did not get here in 24 hours or 48 hours. He got here because for over 9 years in this book, Mordecai has been a noble man. What's that song we teach children to sing? This little Christian light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. What did Jesus say? You shall be light of the world, salt. Though the captivity is ended, and some Jews have stayed in the foreign lands they're taken away from, they still practice their religion and their faith in God. This man's faith in God made him honorable before he was even honored. That even the non-Jews are rejoice and are glad. In verse 16, the Jews see their guy step up. Their guy becomes vice president of this vast kingdom under the king. I mean, you just see how everything has changed. And then when you see that everything is published throughout the land, we see that even in other cities, how did the Jews and Persians react throughout this kingdom? They rejoiced.
They rejoiced.
In gladness, because that first decree was strange. We're supposed to kill our Jewish neighbors and steal all their stuff. Now, there were some rascals that were ready to do that. I don't think most of the kingdom wanted to do that. But it was a law that they had to do that. But it was very awkward. It was very awkward. But this decree has changed it. This is righteousness in a nation taking place. John, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was going to say, kind of back to Tony's point and what you were getting at as well, is with Mordecai, I think there are things that are safe to imply.
Yes.
Knowing what we know historically and about monarchies. Mordecai wasn't like some Jewish guy out there selling baskets and knickknacks in a stall somewhere in a market. For him to have been close to the king's court.
He was.
And for him to have been within physical proximity, to have heard the plot from the two eunuchs that he thwarted that were going to kill the king. And so he obviously had been on a long-term arc of, I don't know, ascension in a way, anyhow, right?
He was.
And so people, that would not have been any secret. People back then would have realized, that's a good guy over there, that's a good guy.
Yes.
And on the other side of that coin, it was probably no secret that Haman was a worm, a low down, dirty dog. I mean, because people back then weren't ignorant. We've just got lights electrically and technology, but the human nature is unchanged.
Right.
So they realize that, and so that's part of the thing I think we just can't kind of miss, is this was not Mordecai.
Two very different men.
Suddenly just being the right guy and having that opportunity. He had, God is not mocked. What you sow, you reap. So Mordecai had obviously been sowing the right kind of seed in his life to have reaped that kind of opportunity.
You're right.
And of course, Haman sowed a crop as well, and he reaped it.
Yes. And the point I want to make is his faith got him there. He didn't use his faith for job promotion.
Yeah.
His faith in serving God made him a better man and a righteous man who did righteous deeds. And that naturally got him, you reap what you sow.
Yeah.
That naturally got him there. And also, you don't know if the hand of God put him there.
Exactly.
You know, like
All
with
that
Daniel
profit,
and other
everything
students,
that's at
like
work
Joseph. But God could use Mordecai because he was faithful.
Yeah.
Now, Tony had his hand up, and then Linda.
2 points. To go on what you guys are saying about Mordecai, that right there is a man that allowed his actions to speak for him versus him speaking for himself. Second point is, you were talking about both Jews and Persians rejoiced over the new decree. I also saw fear in this, because if you notice, it also stated that many of them converted to Judaism in fear of the Jews rising up.
Yes. Being the good class you are, you're always ahead of me. I mean, I try every week to get ahead of you all. But many of the Persians and Indians and other nations that are mentioned here, all of the different provinces, convert to Judaism, but I have the word convert in quotation marks for a reason. Very good point. Haman disturbed a nation. And Haman literally got the end of his rope, and he got his due punishment. Unrighteousness here did not prevail. Righteousness did prevail for several reasons. One, because righteousness is better than unrighteousness. Number two, God's hand is using the Jewish people to bring Jesus into the world, part of his plan of salvation before time began. And a rascal like, or what do you say, a worm? Hope worms aren't offended by the comparison. A worm like Haman is not going to disturb the eternal plan of a powerful eternal God.
All I was gonna add to that, along with what John's saying, is that Haman was so jealous of Mordecai, undoubtedly, because, he just totally resented that whole scene.
He did, and we just have 2 records of it, but it had to be not 2 events over the 100 days. He walked by that gate, and Mordecai was there probably more than twice, I'm assuming. But it was just, his countenance would be all grand and high and happy, and then he'd talk about Mordecai to his family, and he'd just bring himself down. He did it to himself.
Wait, can I ask him?
Yes.
Even when he came out, when Esther sent him back to do the fast, they see him in sackcloth and ashes.
Yes.
So then he comes back, and he's in robes, and
very good point.
so it's like, wouldn't you be intimidated too? Like, wait, he's been reverenced this,
Yes, yes. Let people see you practice your faith, that you may glorify your Father in heaven. Judaism probably got a poll increase throughout the whole nation through all this, because Mordecai and Esther were such wonderful leaders, examples in that way.
There's a couple lessons that I can't help but not overlook in this, relating it to everyday life of ours. So Mordecai, he ended up in a position of power.
Yes.
And people noticed that, and they feared him after that, and he got his, so to speak. Like he got that reverence and that fear. But what a lot of people didn't see before that was all the hardship that he had went through before he got to that point.
Yes.
And that's just a great example for us, that even though people are not seeing that hardship that you're going through, or the stress, or the issues, you still will end up where you need to be.
Yes.
So
But who does see it?
yeah.
God. And who does help us behind the scenes? God. I'm not saying you're going to go out here and get a pay raise or a job promotion, make more money or something in your life. We serve God, and God's going to serve His purposes in this world. And God may use you at the right place at the right time to help somebody know Jesus Christ. You just, God works.
On the back end of that, when Mordecai got that position of power, some people started to fear him just then.
Yes.
Mordecai didn't change.
No.
Though a lot of people thought of him differently.
Yes.
He was still the same man that he was before, but people may think of him as a changed, a different type of person.
Right.
But people don't see the front and the back end of things all the time.
So if Mordecai is wearing sackcloth and ashes, if he was wearing his regular clothes, then the sackcloth and ashes, now he's wearing royal clothes and the crown from the king, what made Mordecai not change? What was his balance in life?
His faith.
Y'all had a good faith,
God.
God, yes, faith in God. Faith in God is a foundation in life, and you do reap what you sow.
And then you'll look, even if you're the outlook, you say, well, this hasn't been such a bad guy. And although we was fearful of Haman, but this person and his characteristics, look how he's been lifted up. So why wouldn't I want to serve who he serves?
Yes, yes, yes. So, that part, before we skip forward 9 months, at the end of verse 17, now I said 9 months, I had to have time to write these things and get the fastest horses and get everybody ready. So you may have less than 9 months, but the main events is about 9 months later. When it says, then many of the people of the land became Jews, but why does the Bible say they became Jews?
Fear.
Fear.
Fear. Because the fear of the Jews fell on them. First, notice how God can change anything. You have a law of the land that cannot be changed, that every Jew in 12 months on the 13th day are going to be killed. You know, Mordecai could have panicked, threw up his hands and quit God. Esther just could have threw up her hands. All the Jews could have quit. But no, they stepped up. The Jews had good leaders, Mordecai and Esther. Because they stepped up, what you see is that the Jews are going to be killed and all their possessions taken. It's a done deal. Because you can't change this law. And on earth, you know, how are we going to change this? Well, Esther and Mordecai had a plan. Esther had 3 days to make the plan, and she carries it out in 48 hours. Now, the Jews are taught throughout the nation, and people are converting to their religion, and they'll be afraid to touch a Jew. Now, some people do try to touch the Jews, and you know they lose their lives because of it. But for the most part, people converted. But why do I have the word converted there in quotation marks? Did they convert to God, or convert just to being
They converted to a religion.
Jewish? Yeah. We don't know their hearts. Maybe they converted to Judaism. Maybe they were proselytes. That could have happened. It could have happened that many did it just because, you know, they don't want to get killed by the Jews. You know, I've been a Persian all my life. I'm glad you've been my Jewish neighbor. I became a Jew this morning. You know, come over here and let's break some unleavened bread together. You know, you never know. But what you do know is the influence of what happens in verse 17 because of the new law of the land. So we're leaving chapter 8, and I couldn't come up with a fancy title or anything for chapter 9. I simply call this Esther's Feast of Purim. Jews still practice Purim today. It is not a festival or holiday given under the Old Testament law. It is one of the customary holidays of the Jews that happened in this book. Because of this book, it is still practiced today, and on the screen you can buy that Purim cookbook. I found that. Spring Feast and Purim. If you want to read up on how the Jews practice things, and that's I guess, a cookbook, and instructions on how to practice the Jewish holiday of Purim. I thought that was interesting that if Esther was written, go back to about the year, if Esther took place about 486 BC, now we're at, what, 2025? 2,500 years have gone by. Am I getting that about right? About 2,500 years have gone by. And what happened in the Bible is still practiced today in the world. It's just astounding to me that something that took place and God helped take place 2,500 years ago is still seen today, still practiced today. So we left off in chapter 8, whenever we were in the month of Sivan, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, in verse 9. Now in chapter 9 and verse 1, it says now in the 12th month, the other month was the 3rd month, and we remember looking at the calendar last week, Jewish calendar. This is the month of Adar on the 13th day. This is the day of the first decree was supposed to take place. The time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed. That's that decree that Haman put out, but also the new decree that the king has put out that the Jews can protect themselves. So the two opposing decrees are put out. On the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. The Jews gathered together in the cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could withstand them because the fear of them fell upon all the people. And all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews because of the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. You see some Bible there. You see some regular everyday politics there that you can see today. The tables have turned. So events move forward 9 months to the month of Adar. 2 opposing decrees and laws are initiated. We see that in this, that the fear of the Jews had fallen upon the people. Some of the people did try to oppose the Jews, but the leaders of the land, the satraps, the governors, all helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. Why did the fear of Mordecai fall upon them? You got to get this. You got to get this political strata in your mind.
He's under the king. He's vice president.
He's under the king.
He hasn't changed it. I think it's just his position he has now that they're fearing.
Right, and they're all under Mordecai now. Now, when you began this book, 9 or 10 years earlier now, who was under the king in chapter 1? It was just the satraps and the governors. That's before Haman was inserted between the two. So now we see that because, they know who the vice president of the kingdom is, they all fear him, so they help the Jews in verse 11. So verse 1, 2 opposing decrees take place. Verse 2, the kings gather together to protect themselves. And it's interesting that it says, and no one could withstand them because fear of them fell upon all the people. Maybe this was the way a fight would carry out anyways and Jews would win. Maybe God's providence was there helping them in these events. We see that the leaders of every city and province and state within this vast kingdom support the Jews. And then I want you to pick up on, so Mordecai becomes second in command in chapter 8. Mordecai in chapter 8 and verse 15 is honored. Mordecai seems to become very prominent to the end of this book. I want you to jump over to chapter 10 and verse 2, and what do you see? The one who wrote this book, if it was Nehemiah or another writer, they thought this commentary, this conclusion at the end of the book, Now all the acts of his powers and his might, and the account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? So just notice, while Esther is queen, Mordecai gets a lot of light shined on him in chapter 9, and it begins in chapter 8, and even ends at the end of this book. So verse 4, for Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai became increasingly prominent. What other Bible characters kind of start off low on the totem pole, or average, but because of God they moved up to very high positions? Joseph. Just a shepherd, becomes a slave, becomes second under, does jail time, thrown in prison for false charges, given second command over Egypt, vice president of Egypt. Who else? David, yeah, David becomes king, and then he's a man on the run, and you know that's one story. It's hard to document the timeline, but I've read anything that he was on the run for 8 years. He could have been on the run for 15 years. Then he finally gets to become king in 2 Samuel. Who else? Moses, yeah, Moses, high, low, leader, great leader of God's people, becomes an image of Christ, becomes a prototype of Christ, lawgiver, saves the people. Did somebody mention Daniel? Yeah, Daniel. And so it's just interesting that the writer of this book, as we've mentioned before, is so detailed with exactly what happened with the events, exactly the customs and things of the Persian Empire and people and the Persian courts, the things of the Jews. The book is written in great detail, and he's detailing, Mordecai in this. And look at verse 5. Let me check my time where we're at. We've got a few minutes left. Then the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword. It sounds like whoosh. It just happened. Stroke of the sword. With slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. And in Shushan, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. We see that in verse 7 and in verse 8 and verse 9, that in other cities the Jews also prevailed. It's interesting that the writer of the book details, perhaps these would be like prominent cities throughout the empire. You might think of Houston, Texas, or Greenville, South Carolina, or other, New York City, other great cities throughout our country. We see in verse 10 that the 10 sons of Haman, and I think this is the third time he's called the enemy of the Jews. They are also killed, but notice this in verse 10, but they did not lay a hand on the plunder. On that day, the number of those who were killed in Shushan, the citadel, was brought to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan, the citadel, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done to the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. Or what is your further request? It shall be done. Were the king and Esther on the same page? Oh yes. The king did not like being used by Haman. And this thing is not over with. I mean, this is, you think about whenever a war goes on for a period of time, how do you say that? It's a, help me out, not elongated, a campaign. There's another word I'm looking for, but prolonged, something like prolonged. So this problem, or this fighting, has been prolonged over maybe days and weeks. And it's, we see that in the war room, Esther and the king come back to get their minds together on what to do. And what I want us to notice is, I want to ask the questions when we bring our class to a close, so we're going to have to stop here in a moment. Why were the Jews triumphant? Think about it. Why were the Jews triumphant? I could think of 2 or 3 reasons.
Their confidence, once they seen
Confidence.
how Mordecai came back,
Yes.
he's second in command, so their confidence probably was increased.
Confidence was increased. I think you're exactly right. What else?
God.
Pardon? They were of the lineage of Christ. The hand of God was not going to have it any other way. Not any other way. What did you say?
Said God.
God. I'd say their faith. Their faith in God.
Well, if you stop and look at it, when the Israelites were entering into the land of milk and honey, God said, I will be with you.
Yes.
Look at Gideon, a judge.
Yes.
He had 10,000 men. God chopped it down to 300 so that he could show them who was actually there with them and
Right.
taking care of them.
This shows us faith is the victory. The people feared the Jews. The second law went out from the king, from Esther, from Mordecai. Mordecai and Esther wrote that law, that second decree. You get Mordecai's signet ring from the king stamped on that thing. No wonder they feared Mordecai. So the last question I want you to think about, well, the sons of Haman are executed. We could say more about that, but I want to press on. I want to ask this question and stop here. Did the Jews plunder their enemies? You're going to have this spoken several times. When you look at verse 10, did the Jews in Shushan plunder their enemies?
So they did not.
And in all the other provinces, when you read on, do the Jews plunder their enemies and take their houses or possessions or gold and or silver? No. But in the decree of Haman, what was the law? When the people were going to kill the Jews. Take all their possessions. Why did the Jews not plunder their enemies? I don't know we're given an answer for that. Maybe it was part of the decree of Mordecai. Maybe it's simply because the Jews were not going to be that kind of people. I see something noble if on their own there is something noble about them not plundering their enemies. They're not going to cause chaos all throughout this empire of the king and kill their enemies. That's bloody enough. And then you go take all their stuff. No, they protected themselves. They, didn't go out to kill anybody. They protected themselves. That's why other people got killed. And they did not plunder their enemies. Was in this time with kingdoms and people, even under David when he was on the run, you plundered your enemies. You plundered cities. The Jews didn't do that.
It's the difference between defensive behavior and predatory behavior.
Yes. Very good. They had defensive behavior, and they served somebody greater than King Ahasuerus. They served God. I find it very curious, though we're not really given an answer why, they did not plunder their enemies. And that would make the Jews more respectable after this is over and time goes on. So we're going to stop here. You've been a great class. We'll pick up here next week. I ask you to finish reading. Go ahead and finish reading the book, and we'll get to close to the end of the book next week. And you've been a great class. We'll take a break for our worship. Thank you.
Not too bad. I caught family.